The room fell silent. Not because of a shout, but because someone stepped back. Petty Officer Rivera, a seasoned SEAL with 17 years of experience, gently placed his Mk-18 rifle on the table. The weapon was an extension of himself, trusted like no other, but now he set it before a woman. No uniform, no rank, no one knew her name. All they knew was that the moment he stepped back, every eye turned to her. She didn't look at anyone, she didn't say a word. Her hands rested on the rifle as if she'd been doing this her whole life. And Rivera, a man who never let anyone touch his personal weapon, spoke only 3 words. Let her finish. The greatest trust sometimes needs no explanation, and the most remarkable stories are often the ones never told. In the next 30 minutes, you'll understand why true respect doesn't come from titles, but from a skill that cannot be faked. No one really noticed when she started showing up. She wasn't part of any squad, didn't arrive with a clipboard or walk like she belonged. Just a quiet figure tucked in the back corner of the rifle bay sleeves, rolled up, working on things others didn't want to touch. Her badge said, Armory Support Technician. The kind of title people don't ask about, not because it's important, but because it usually isn't. They called her ma'am when they bothered to speak at all. Most didn't. To them, she was just another civilian contract. The kind that showed up through some subcontractor's program hired to clean observe report and stay out of the way. But what stood out was that she never looked lost. She wasn't watching to learn. She was watching to remember, and that's what made Rivera stop the first time. Not because of what she was doing, but how she was doing it. Some people fake confidence. Margaret Hayes didn't have to. The rifle bay was never a quiet place. You'd hear the familiar rhythm tools clinking trays, dropping metal on metal boots, scuffing the floor. Conversations ran constant complaints about trigger creep, jokes about optics, the usual banter from guys who'd been in too long to pretend they cared about protocol. But where Margaret worked, there was a kind of stillness. No music, no small talk, just the methodical pull of a cleaning cloth through the chamber, the soft click of parts being seated just right. It wasn't something most noticed, not at first. She didn't interrupt anyone, didn't correct mistakes or offer advice. She just kept working quietly, precisely, consistently. There's something unsettling about someone who does things well and never talks about it. And the truth is, you can't ignore that kind of silence forever. At some point, someone starts paying attention. Rivera wasn't the first, but he was the first to act on it. Most of the weapons that landed on her bench weren't the clean ones. They were the headaches rifles that failed diagnostics, 3 times bolt assemblies. No one could figure out systems that technically worked, but didn't feel right when fired. The kind of gear that made even senior armorers sigh before picking them up. That's the pile that ended up in Margaret's hands. No one assigned them to her. They just appeared, maybe because no one else wanted to deal with them, maybe because someone quietly noticed they came back better than before. Operators started whispering. Feels smoother. Whatever she did, it works. But no one said it too loud. Respect in a place like this wasn't given with applause. It showed up in smaller ways, like the absence of complaints, or the way guys stopped double-checking her work, but not everyone was ready to admit it. At least, not yet. Officially, she wasn't on any rotation. Margaret didn't appear on the morning duty list. She wasn't briefed during shift change, never called during surprise inspections. Most assumed she was just part of some support contract, the kind that gets renewed without anyone really knowing why. And maybe that's what made it easier to ignore her. She didn't ask for a nameplate. Didn't wear unit patches or bring up where she'd been posted before. Some figured she was retired military, maybe a favor higher. Others joked not unkindly that she was someone's aunt with too much time on her hands. She never corrected them. Correction would have required explanation. And Margaret didn't owe anyone one. She came in, she worked, and she left. Every single day. What nobody realized back then was that she was already carrying the weight of something they couldn't see. There were things Margaret never said. Not because she was hiding anything, but because some things just don't belong in conversations about torque specs and firing pin wear. But if you paid close attention, you'd notice something. She never asked for help, never checked the manuals, and never once used the standard disassembly cheat sheets that hung above every workbench. She didn't need them. Somehow, her hands just knew. The way she aligned scopes without measuring. The way she cleared malfunctions most guys hadn't even diagnosed yet. It wasn't luck, And it wasn't just experience, it was memory. Not the kind you pick up from training manuals, but the kind you earn when equipment failure means someone doesn't come home. People assumed she was quiet because she was shy. They were wrong. She was quiet because she remembered too much. She never guessed. That was the thing. Everything Margaret touched she handled like she already knew what was wrong. No trial and error, no second passes, just a slow, steady rhythm like her hands had solved that exact problem 100 times before. Some thought it was luck. Others said she probably Googled things when no one was looking, but those who watched closely knew better. One tech had spent half a day trying to retime a gas system that kept locking up under heat. Margaret walked by, paused for maybe 5 seconds, reached over, made a single turn and said, "That one's running lean," then walked away. It worked perfectly after that. No follow-up. No, "I told you so." Just her usual silence. And slowly, so slowly you almost didn't notice people started looking at her work a little differently. Most folks just let her be. In a place full of noise and motion, Margaret's quiet corner was easy to forget unless you needed something fixed. Then, suddenly people remembered she was there. But Rivera had noticed earlier than most. He didn't say anything at first. That wasn't his style. But every time he passed by, he slowed just enough to catch a glimpse of what she was doing. Not what she was fixing, how she was fixing it. The way she handled the parts. The muscle memory in her hands. The quiet focus that never broke even when someone was cursing about a stripped thread or a missed range slot across the room. He'd seen that kind of concentration before. Not in armories, but in combat zones. Margaret never looked up when he passed. But Rivera. He was already starting to look twice. One afternoon, Rivera didn't just pass by, he stopped. Not with a question, not to test her, and definitely not to make conversation. He just leaned against the opposite bench, arms crossed, eyes steady, and watched. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't look up or change her pace. Her hands kept moving, disassembling a jammed bolt like it was second nature. To anyone else, it looked like routine maintenance. But Rivera had spent 2 decades watching people work under pressure. He knew the difference between skill and instinct. Knew what it looked like when someone wasn't thinking through a problem, they were remembering it. Like their hands had done it in worse conditions. Louder ones. Ones that smelled like cordite and blood. And right then, Rivera understood something. She wasn't just good. She'd been there. Rivera didn't say anything that day. He just nodded once like something had clicked into place and walked off. But the next time a rifle came in with a misaligned gas block, one that everyone else had passed around and grumbled about, he brought it straight to her bench. Didn't explain. Didn't ask. Just set it down and said, "It's not cycling clean." Margaret didn't even glance up. She just pulled a cloth from the tray and got to work like she'd been expecting it. The room didn't notice. Most were too caught up in their own gear, their own timelines. But Rivera stayed close, not hovering, just present, watching. Sometimes trust doesn't start with a grand gesture. Sometimes it starts with handing over a problem and stepping back to see what happens. A few days later, it happened. Rivera walked in after hours, the bay half-empty tools, quiet just the low hum of a ventilation fan overhead. Margaret was at her bench as usual, wiping down a stripped lower receiver like she had all the time in the world. He didn't speak at first, just stood there holding something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, every technician nearby paused. It was his rifle. Not just any weapon, the custom Mk-18 he'd built himself over the years. Tuned, tested, balanced, down to the ounce. No one had ever touched it but him. And now... He set it down in front of her. No speech, no explanation. Just 3 words, quiet but clear enough to cut through the entire room. Let her finish. No one moved. Because in places like this, respect doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it enters in silence. Nobody said a word. A couple of techs froze mid-task. One guy let his wrench hang in mid-air like he'd forgotten what he was doing. Even the background noise, the distant clatter of gear low muttering, faded. Rivera had just broken an unspoken rule. You didn't hand over your personal rifle, not unless it was an emergency and definitely not to someone no one could vouch for. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Someone else laughed nervously, unsure if this was a joke, but Rivera didn't move. Arms folded, eyes steady. The message was clear. He wasn't testing her. He'd already decided. And in that quiet pause something subtle shifted. Not in the chain of command, not on paper, but in the air, the way you feel weather changing before you see the clouds. Because now, all eyes were on Margaret. Margaret didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the weight of what had just happened, didn't react to the silence or the dozen eyes now fixed on her. She simply reached for the rifle like it was just another job in a long line of jobs. But her hands, they moved differently. Slower, more deliberate, not hesitant, but respectful. As if she recognized what this weapon meant. As if she'd held rifles like this before, not in a bay but out where a mistake could cost someone their life. She ran her fingers along the receiver, paused near the gas block, tilted her head slightly. Then, with nothing but the sound of skin against metal, she found it a microfracture along the weld line. Most wouldn't have seen it. But Margaret, she didn't need to see. She could feel what was wrong. And just like that, the room stopped watching a contractor. They started watching a professional. She didn't rush. Margaret moved with the kind of patience you don't learn in training, the kind that only comes from having fixed things under pressure in places where taking your time meant saving someone else's. She reached into her own kit, not the standard issue tools everyone else used, but a set worn soft at the handles. The kind of tools that travel with you not because they're pretty, but because they've never failed you. A curved pick slightly bent. A dental mirror with no shine. Nothing about it looked military. Everything about it said experience. She worked in near silence. No narration. No requests for parts. No look what I'm doing. Just a woman, a rifle, and a room slowly learning to shut up and pay attention. Some people demand respect. She just created space for it, and that silence. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was earned. She didn't need schematics. Margaret pressed her ear gently to the rifle, rotated the upper receiver, then tapped twice near the bolt catch. To an outsider it looked strange, unnecessary even. But those who'd been downrange knew better. Sometimes your ears tell you more than a scope ever will. Sometimes the sound of a weapon under stress says what diagnostics can't. Rivera leaned forward slightly. Not to interfere, just to listen. She held the rifle close, let it breathe, then slid the bolt group free without forcing a single piece. No scratches, no overcorrection, just balance like she'd built the thing herself. Nobody in that room had ever seen someone listen to a weapon like that. Not at a stateside base, not in peace. And the way she moved... You'd think she was remembering a rifle that had once saved a life or failed to. Either way, she knew the difference. And now, so did everyone watching. Rivera had seen a lot of people fix weapons. Some were fast, some were careful. A few were genuinely gifted, but none of them moved like this. There was no checking the clock, no subtle glances around to see who was watching. Margaret didn't treat the rifle like a task, she treated it like something that had to be made right. Not just functional, right. It hit him then, this wasn't just about carbon buildup or microfractures or worn springs. She was fixing something else too. Maybe not for herself, maybe not even for him, but for someone who hadn't come back. Or maybe for someone who still might. And in that moment, Rivera understood this woman didn't work in the armory because she needed a job. She worked there because she still had something left to repair. When she finished, there was no announcement. Margaret didn't hold the rifle up or call Rivera over. She didn't explain what she found or how she fixed it. She didn't need to. She simply set it down, clean aligned, solid on his side of the bench, then wiped her hands, and walked away. Not out of defiance, not with drama, just like she'd done this 1,000 times before and would do it again tomorrow. No eye contact, no nod, no "you're welcome." The room stayed quiet as if no one wanted to break the air she left behind. Rivera didn't move for a full 30 seconds. He just stared at the weapon, then at the empty space where she'd stood, and in that stillness, something settled. Not in words, not even in thought. Just in the way silence sometimes feels like the loudest thing in the room. No one talked about it. The next day, Rivera's rifle sat back on his rack cleaner, tighter, smoother than before. He didn't say what she'd done to it, and no one asked. But people noticed. Not just the weapon, but the way he treated it now. The way his hand paused just a moment longer on the grip like he trusted it more. Like something had been restored, not replaced. Round the bay, conversations kept happening, but a little softer, a little more careful. When Margaret walked past, no one looked away anymore. A few nodded. It wasn't respect yet, not fully, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was the space in between, that quiet moment when people start realizing they may have judged too soon, and aren't sure how to admit it out loud. And it always starts the same way: they stop laughing, and they start listening. It started with a small click. A junior operator name stitched into his sleeve, but unfamiliar to most, walked across the bay holding a weapon close to his chest. Not broken exactly, but not right either. One of those rifles that had been just fine since inspection but never fired quite the way it should. He didn't make a show of it, didn't ask for clearance. He just walked to Margaret's bench, set it down carefully, and left without saying a word. Margaret didn't look up. She simply pulled the weapon toward her the same way she always did and got to work. No one laughed. No one commented. Because in that small exchange, barely 30 seconds long, something unspoken passed between them. A rifle. A question. And trust quiet, unannounced but real. At first, no one asked anything. But over the next week, the questions started to shift. Not the loud locker room kind. No teasing, no gossip, just quiet check-ins, soft pauses at her bench. "Hey, where'd you learn to clean like that? Did you work with optics before? Just curious, ever been around a field team?" Margaret never offered much in return. A nod, a glance, a short answer if that. She didn't evade, she just didn't elaborate. And maybe that's what kept them coming back. Because sometimes the more someone doesn't say, the more you want to understand why. There was a feeling now not just that she was good, but that there was more to the story. Something tucked just behind her silence. And for some reason, everyone was okay with not knowing it all at once. Staff Sergeant Thompson had seen a lot of personnel files. It was part of the job. 23 years in, you get good at spotting patterns: who's fresh out of tech school, who's bouncing between contracts, who's just passing time until retirement. But when he pulled Margaret Hayes' file, something didn't sit right. It wasn't that anything looked wrong. It was that almost nothing was there. No record of boot camp, no standard quals, no unit history, no certifications beyond the bare minimum for access, just a name, a clearance level that felt too high, and a line at the bottom that read simply, "Authorized Class A Storage, Level 3, Armament Access." He stared at the screen a little longer than usual, because if this was just a civilian contractor, why did her file look like someone had gone out of their way to leave it blank? Thompson didn't rattle easy. He'd worked through audits, investigations, even one internal leak that almost grounded a whole unit. He knew when something was off, and more importantly, when something was meant to be off. But this was different. Tucked deep in the metadata, buried under layers of standard contractor codes, was a single reference line, half faded, likely not meant to be visible at all. It read, "Former SOTE, Field Armorer, Status, Retired, Not Discharged." He blinked. SOTE. He'd seen SOT-A through D before Special Operations teams assigned to recon signals mobility, but E. That wasn't in the system. It wasn't in anyone's system. He leaned back in his chair, hand still resting on the mouse heart, not racing, but focused now. This wasn't a resume gap. It was a deliberate blank space, and that kind of silence only shows up when something used to be loud. Thompson wasn't the kind to chase shadows, but once you've spent enough years in the system, you learn that what's missing often says more than what's written. SOTE. Retired, not discharged. No deployments listed, no injury reports, no medals, just nothing. But the more he sat with it, the more the gaps started to whisper. That way, she never asked for parts she already knew where they were. The old habits, how she kept her tools wrapped in cloth, not plastic. How she always checked the firing pin, last knot, first like the manuals say. He'd seen one other person do that. Back in Kandahar. Quiet guy, green eyes, worked in a tent with no name. Fixed a sniper's rifle under flashlight in the middle of a dust storm. They'd called him essential. And just like Margaret, he'd disappeared a year later without a goodbye. And now the pieces were starting to fall into place. Not loud, just steady. Some people retire with plaques. Some fade out with ceremony-folded flags, long speeches no one really listens to. Margaret didn't get any of that, because people like her don't retire, they vanish. Not because they're erased, but because what they carried can't be filed, processed, or framed. It's not in the official records. It lives in the things they still do by habit. In the silences they keep without trying. Thompson stared at the screen a little longer, then closed the file. He didn't print anything, didn't call command. He just sat there for a minute staring at the worn edge of his desk, replaying the last few weeks in his mind. How nobody ever told her what to do, and somehow she always did the right thing anyway. There was only one thought left in his head after that: she hadn't come back to finish her service. She came back because part of it had never really ended. Nobody asked her about the file. Not Thompson, not Rivera, not anyone. They didn't need to, because at some point you stop needing names, acronyms, or clearance levels to know who someone really is. You just watch how others start treating them, and that's what changed first. Operators stopped dropping gear without a word. Now they placed it down gently, like they were offering it, not assigning it. Questions shifted too. No more "can you fix this?" It became, "What would you recommend?" It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. Respect wasn't declared. It was shown in nods across the bay, in the way younger techs waited their turn to speak, and how Rivera started calling her by name. Not ma'am, just Hayes. And maybe that was the quiet proof everyone needed. She hadn't just earned her place in the room, she'd had it all along. They just hadn't known where to look. The work didn't change. Rifles still came in jammed. Scopes still needed recalibration. Springs wore out bolts, stuck pins went missing. The same checklist, the same pressure, but the room felt different. Conversations dropped in volume when Hayes worked. Not out of fear, out of something closer to reverence. A kind of learned stillness, like people didn't want to interrupt a rhythm that was older than they understood. Even the music, the background noise someone always kept running, started staying off longer. No one told them to, but when respect grows, noise shrinks. Guys who used to brag about mods now asked for second opinions. Laughter still happened, but softer, more grounded. And at some point someone started referring to her corner as Hayes's bench. Not officially, not even directly. Just one of those quiet changes that sticks. Because it finally feels like the right way to say it. Nobody planned it. There was no meeting, no order, no post-it on the whiteboard. But one afternoon, a young tech barely 6 months in cleaned a rifle, then paused. He glanced toward Hayes's bench. It was empty. She'd already clocked out, but he still walked over and placed the rifle there. Neat, centered, trigger up, then walked away. When someone asked why he didn't just leave it in the rack like always, he shrugged. That's how she does it. No one argued. In fact, by the end of the week, 3 others were doing the same, placing gear like she did, cleaning in the order she preferred, folding cloths her way, not because they were told to, but because something about it felt right. Efficient, clean, respectful. She'd never given a lecture, never corrected anyone out loud, and yet somehow Hayes had written a standard no memo could match. It showed up on a Monday. No announcement, no unveiling. Just there, tucked against the far wall near the corner where Hayes always worked. A rack. Simple. Unpainted wood reinforced at the joints. Built solid but not flashy. It looked like it had always belonged there. But it hadn't. At the center, one rifle sat perfectly balanced, Rivera's Mk18, the same one she'd fixed without saying a word. Cleaned, calibrated, cared for, and untouched since. Beneath it, a small brass plate. No name. Just 3 engraved words, "Let her finish." No one asked who built it. No one needed to, because the moment you saw it, you understood. It wasn't about medals, or rank, or recognition. It was a reminder for every hand that would touch a weapon again that sometimes the quietest person in the room sets the tone for all of it. Hayes walked in that morning like she always did. No change in her pace, same faded boots, same quiet nod to the guard at the door. She set her mug down, tied her apron, unwrapped her tools. Everything exactly the way it had been for months. But the room wasn't the same. Conversations paused just a half-second longer when she passed. A few heads turned, then quickly looked away. Not in discomfort, but with the kind of awareness that comes after you've missed something for too long, and finally started to see it. She glanced once toward the new rack in the corner. Didn't touch it. Didn't ask. Just gave it a long, unreadable look. Then sat at her bench and got to work like it was just another Tuesday. but for everyone else. That moment, that silence, that return, it felt like something had finally come full circle. Without needing to be said, nobody ever gave Hayes a ceremony. No framed certificate, no group photo, no speech with years of dedicated service. She wouldn't have wanted one anyway, because the people who carry the heaviest things usually set them down quietly. What she left behind wasn't written on a board or filed in a report. It was in the way others now placed rifles on the bench, in the stillness that followed when someone said, "Let her finish." Not a rule, a reminder that competence doesn't shout, that trust is earned, not requested, and that the quietest one in the room might just be the reason the rest make it home. She still comes in early, still works past shift, still doesn't say much. But if you ask anyone in that bay who they'd trust with their weapon, their life, the answer comes easy now, even if it's spoken softly. If you believe not all heroes need a spotlight, drop a simple, "Let me finish," and maybe, just maybe, someone out there will finally be seen.